7:30 in the morning at a downtown construction site. A new civic library rising 4 stories out of what had, until 2 years earlier, been a weed-choked vacant lot. A man in a hard hat with a rolled-up set of revised blueprints tucked under his arm, walking the perimeter alone in the quiet before the day's crew arrives. A patrol car pulls up to the site fence, idles a moment, then stops. Within 3 minutes, that same man is handcuffed against a stack of scaffolding. Accused of trespassing on a project he not only has every legal right to be standing on, but personally designed from the ground up. And within the half hour, an entire line of city officials will arrive for a long-scheduled site inspection, only to find the building's own lead architect sitting cuffed at his own gate. This is the story of a wrongful arrest at a public construction site, an officer who mistook a project's lead architect for a common intruder, and the delegation of city officials whose fortunately timed arrival turned what might have been a quiet, private humiliation into a very public reckoning that no one involved could afterward pretend hadn't happened. Julian Ross had spent nearly 20 years working as an architect, the last 8 of them running his own well-respected firm, and the civic library, now rising steadily out of that downtown lot, represented without question the single most significant public commission of his entire career. He'd won the open design competition for it 2 years earlier against several larger and far more established firms, his proposal ultimately chosen for the specific way it deliberately opened the building outward toward the surrounding neighborhood rather than walling it defensively off from it. A design philosophy he'd spent his whole professional life carefully refining, and that had finally found its fullest, most complete expression in this one deeply personal project. He was a meticulous, genuinely hands-on architect of the increasingly rare kind who still insisted on walking his own construction sites regularly, rather than managing everything remotely from behind a desk, holding firmly to the belief that a building revealed quiet truths during construction that no drawing on the screen ever could, and that being physically present to catch small problems early, before they became expensive ones, was well worth every early morning hour it cost him. He'd grown up in the very same neighborhood the new library was being built to serve, had spent countless childhood afternoons in the cramped, chronically underfunded old branch that this new building was finally replacing, and he had poured something genuinely and unmistakably personal into the design. A quiet, stubborn determination that the children growing up where he once had would inherit a far better, brighter, more welcoming space than the one he'd known as a boy. His mother had been the one who first brought him to that old library branch week after week, insisting even during the hardest stretches of their life that a library can't cost nothing and opened everything, and Julian had carried the weight of that simple conviction with him through architecture school and every project since. This particular building, more than any he'd ever designed, was in many ways a letter written back across the years to the boy he'd been in that cramped old branch, which was precisely why the events of that morning would land with a sting far sharper than mere inconvenience. That particular morning, Julian arrived at the site early, well before the construction crew's scheduled start time, dressed in the entirely standard site attire of hard hat, sturdy work boots, and a bright high-visibility safety vest, a fresh-rolled set of the latest revised blueprints tucked carefully under one arm. He wanted to walk the fourth framing alone in the rare quiet before the crew arrived and the noise began, checking a specific detail in the main reading room ceiling that had been quietly nagging at him ever since the previous week's site meeting. Exactly the kind of careful, unhurried early morning walkthrough that had become his personal signature habit across every single project he had ever led in 20 years of practice. The downtown area had experienced a recent frustrating string of thefts, specifically targeting construction materials and valuable copper wiring from active building sites, prompting a noticeable increase in early morning patrol attention across the district's several ongoing projects, with a general standing instruction issued to officers to watch closely for anyone accessing the sites before the regular crews arrived to begin the day's work. Officer Ryan Delgado, 4 years into the job, spotted Julian moving through the site alone in the soft early light, his hard hat on, and a roll of blueprints in hand, and rather than registering the entirely routine and unremarkable sight of a site professional simply conducting an ordinary early walkthrough, his mind leapt almost immediately to the recent rash of thefts, framing what he was seeing instead as a possible intruder scouting the site, or perhaps preparing to make off with materials before the crew arrived to notice anything at all, had gone messicaw. He pulled his cruiser up to the site's chain-link fence, stepped through the open equipment gate, walking directly past the permit board and signage posted there, and approached Julian across the uneven ground with a deliberate, fully committed posture of an officer who had already, in the space of a few short seconds, largely decided exactly what he was looking at well before he'd bothered to ask a single actual question. "Hold it right there. What are you doing on this site?" Delgado's voice cut sharply across the quiet morning, his hand already resting near his belt as he closed the distance. Julian turned calmly, the rolled blueprint still tucked under his arm. "Morning, officer. I'm the lead architect on this project. Just doing an early walkthrough before the crew gets in for the day." "The architect." Delgado's tone carried an unmistakable, weighted skepticism, his eyes moving slowly over the hard hat, the safety vest, the roll of drawings under Julian's arm. "You got something on you that actually proves that?" "My ID's in my truck, parked right over there by the site trailer," Julian said, gesturing across the lot toward it without any hesitation. "My name's on the project permits posted at the gate you just walked through, and my firm's name is right there on the site signage. This is my building, officer. I designed it, every inch of it. We've had materials and copper stolen off sites all over this area for weeks now. A guy walking around a site alone before anyone else has shown up fits exactly what I've been told to watch for." Delgado's skepticism only hardened further. The multiple readily available paths to simple verification standing directly in front of him, somehow failing entirely to register against the firm assumption he'd already settled into. "Officer, I'm holding a full set of blueprints for this exact building right here under my arm. I am wearing site safety gear. My firm's name is printed on the sign at the gate you personally just walked through to get in here." Julian kept his voice deliberately level and calm, though the deep, familiar weariness of once again having to prove his own legitimacy was already settling heavily into his chest. "Everything you could possibly need to confirm exactly who I am is within about 30 feet of where the two of us are standing right now. Set the blueprints down and put your hands where I can see them." Delgado's command came out sharp and fast, cutting straight across the reasonable explanation as though he hadn't absorbed a single word of it. "I'm setting them down. I'm not resisting you in any way." Julian carefully placed the rolled drawings down on a nearby stack of lumber and slowly raised his open, empty hands. "But I want to be completely clear that I am the architect of record on this entire project, and I have every right in the world to be standing exactly where I am. You can explain all of that to me once I've got you secured." Delgado guided Julian firmly toward a tall stack of scaffolding and cuffed him against it, the cold steel closing around wrists that had spent 2 decades drawing the very buildings he now walked through, radioing in to dispatch what he described as a possible trespasser detained at the downtown library construction site. Julian stood cuffed against the scaffolding as Delgado began slowly looking over the rest of the site, the rolled blueprints sitting exactly where Julian had set them down on the lumber. The deep early morning quiet, now broken only by the periodic crackle of the officer's radio and the first faint, distant sound of the construction crew's vehicles beginning to approach somewhere down the block. "Those permits posted at the gate list the architect of record for this whole project," Julian said evenly, refusing to let his frustration bleed into anything the officer could misread. "That name is mine. Julian Ross. My firm designed this entire building, and I am here on this site nearly every single week personally overseeing its construction." Delgado glanced briefly toward the gate, but notably didn't actually walk over to it to check, his certainty still stubbornly holding despite the steadily mounting evidence contradicting it from every direction. And it was at that precise moment, with Julian still cuffed against the scaffolding and the first crew members only just beginning to pull into the far end of the lot, that a small, orderly convoy of vehicles arrived at the site typically saw, 8 in the morning. Considerably more official than anything a job site typically saw at its site. The vehicles carried a full delegation of city officials arriving for a long-scheduled progress inspection of the publicly funded library project, a deputy city manager, 2 senior members of the city's public works department, and a representative from the mayor's own office, all of whom had arranged this particular visit weeks in advance specifically to review the construction's progress directly with the project's lead architect. The very lead architect they had all come there to meet was, at that exact and deeply inconvenient moment, handcuffed to a stack of scaffolding near the site's front gate. The deputy city manager, a sharp and experienced woman named Patricia Vance, who had worked directly and closely with Julian throughout the entire 2-year design and approval process, took in the scene in front of her with an expression of immediate, wholly undisguised alarm the moment she stepped out of her vehicle. "Officer, what on earth is going on here? That man is Julian Ross. He is the architect on this project. We are here this morning specifically to meet with him." Delgado turned toward the voice, his stubborn certainty finally and fully fracturing under the sudden arrival of an entire delegation of city officials, all plainly and instantly recognizing the man he'd just handcuffed. He told me he was the architect, but he is the architect," Vance said, her voice firm and leaving absolutely no room for argument, already moving quickly across the uneven ground toward Julian. "He designed this building. Every one of us is standing here this morning because of his work. Take those handcuffs off of him right now, officer." Delgado uncuffed Julian quickly now, the undeniable presence of 4 separate city officials all firmly confirming his identity at once, leaving no remaining room whatsoever for the assumption he'd been so stubbornly clinging to only moments before. "Mr. Ross, I sincerely apologize. We've had a lot of thefts in the area recently, and I moved too fast on this. I'm sorry." He walked directly past a gate with my name printed on the permits, past a sign with my own firm's name on it, specifically to put handcuffs on a man standing there holding a set of blueprints and wearing a safety vest, Julian said, calmly rubbing his freed wrists as the concerned officials gathered in a loose circle around him. "I told you plainly who I was. I pointed you toward 3 separate ways to confirm it in under a minute. I would like your name and your badge number, please." Delgado provided the information without protest as the assembled city delegation looked on, the scheduled morning inspection now thoroughly and completely overshadowed by what they had all arrived to find, several of the officials already exchanging the quiet, pointed, knowing glances of people who understood immediately and instinctively that this particular incident would not simply be allowed to fade quietly away. The direct presence of multiple city officials as immediate first-hand witnesses transformed the incident almost instantly from the kind of quiet, private misunderstanding that so often disappeared without a trace into a routine filed report into something the city government itself now had a direct, personal, and immediate interest in seeing properly addressed. Patricia Vance, still visibly and genuinely troubled by what she'd walked into, made clear to Julian before the inspection had even properly begun that the city would be formally raising the entire matter with the police department, both because of how Julian himself had been treated that morning and, just as importantly, because of what it strongly suggested about how those same officers were likely treating countless others who possessed far less standing and far fewer powerful witnesses than a city-contracted lead architect happened to have. Julian, for his own part, handled the charged moment with exactly the same steady composure that had carried him calmly through the encounter itself, quietly insisting that the scheduled inspection proceed as planned regardless. He'd spent 2 years of his life on this building and had absolutely no intention of allowing a wrongful arrest to derail a morning that was supposed to be and would remain about the actual work. But he made equally and unmistakably clear, to the officials now gathered attentively around him, that he fully expected the matter to be taken genuinely seriously, not as any kind of personal favor extended to him because of who he was, but strictly on principle, for the sake of everyone who'd never be lucky enough to have city officials arrive at exactly the right moment. "I can walk straight into a meeting with the deputy city manager barely an hour after being handcuffed at my own gate and have the entire thing quietly made right," Julian said plainly to the group. "Most people who go through precisely what I just went through this morning cannot do that. They have no one arriving to vouch for them. That is the part of this that actually needs looking at, and it's the part I care about. The police department's internal review, conducted with the considerable added weight of multiple credible city officials serving as direct first-hand witnesses, examined Officer Delgado's body camera footage in full, which confirms Julian's account entirely and without exception, his consistently calm and fully cooperative demeanor throughout the whole encounter, his clear and repeated identification of both himself and his specific role on the project, his precise references to the posted permits, the site signage, and his nearby vehicle, and Delgado goes don. In his own interview with investigators, Delgado acknowledged the failure with unusual directness. He gave me 3 separate ways to confirm exactly who he was, and I didn't take a single one of them before I put him in handcuffs, he admitted plainly. The permits with his name on them were posted right there at the gate. I walked directly past them on my way in without even looking. The lead investigator noted pointedly in the final written report that the incident represented an almost textbook failure to verify plainly and readily available information, an unjustified escalation all the way to physical restraint based entirely on a broad generic assumption rather than on any specific articulable evidence actually connecting Julian in any way to the reported string of thefts across the district. Officer Delgado received a formal disciplinary suspension and was required to complete additional training focused specifically on verification procedures before detention, the department's written review pointedly citing the posted permits, the visible site signage, and Julian's own clear, repeated offers of identification as exactly the kind of plain evidence that should have prevented the arrest from ever occurring in the first place. The department, operating now under direct and sustained pressure from a city government that had witnessed the entire incident firsthand, also agreed to conduct a broader review of its guidance for officers responding to reported thefts at active construction and commercial sites throughout the district. The city settled with Julian for the wrongful arrest, and Julian, entirely in character, chose to direct a significant portion of that settlement toward establishing a scholarship fund for young people from his old neighborhood pursuing careers in architecture and the skilled building trades, deliberately extending the very same personal thread that had shaped his design of the library itself from the beginning. A quiet, stubborn determination to open real doors for the children growing up exactly where he once had, with the same limited means and the same unlikely dreams. The library itself, its construction entirely unaffected by the morning's chaos, was completed right on schedule the following year, and Julian stood quietly among the gathered crowd at its public opening, watching with something close to overwhelming emotion as families from the surrounding neighborhood filed in through the doors and into the bright, open, welcoming reading rooms he had designed specifically and lovingly for them. He continued his early morning site walkthroughs on every single project that followed, hard hat and blueprints in hand exactly as always, though he had quietly taken to keeping a laminated copy of his architect credentials clipped directly to his safety vest now, a small practical precaution that cost him nothing at all, and that he privately hoped might spare him any repeat of a morning he knew he would never entirely forget. Patricia Vance and the other city officials who had arrived that morning to find him cuffed against his own scaffolding became, in their own quiet and unplanned way, a genuine part of the reason the incident led to real, lasting change rather than simply vanishing into a quietly buried internal report, their mere presence as credible, insistent witnesses ensuring that a wrong done to one man alone in empty lot at dawn could not simply disappear the way so many similar unwitnessed wrongs had disappeared so many times before it. This story is a reminder that even the clearest, most thoroughly documented authority over a place offers no automatic protection whatsoever from a stranger's split-second assumption about who does and doesn't belong there, and that sometimes genuine accountability arrives not through the long, grinding machinery of a formal complaint process, but through the simple, fortunate accident of exactly the right moment to make sure no one can look away. If this story moved you, hit that like button, share it with someone who needs to see it, and subscribe for more true stories of justice finally catching up.